There was some question earlier today about what time the presentation was. A question on my part, not on anyone else's, not purely not on Brigida Hendricks. So just yesterday, the Algerian Minister of Education announced that universities across that state would have to have an early spring break. This was an attempt to dissipate this growing student-led protest movement. And this is just the latest global event that illustrates the difficulty that higher education poses in non-consolidated, weakly consolidated democracies, as well as authoritarian regimes. In recent years, we've seen outcries in places like Hungary and Russia over the pressures placed on global universities in both of those states. So this backdrop is really provides us kind of an interesting lens to show why Cadet Brigida Hendricks' honors project is just so exciting. She has been working on this project since, in one form or another, really since the fall of 2017. And she's been passionate about it in its various iterations. She has committed herself to familiarizing herself and engaging with pretty complex literature or literatures. There's a variety of different literatures she's tapping into. She's engaged in a really painstaking process of data collection. She's going to talk about that later. I don't know if she really sells how hard it was. It really was painstaking. And she's learned more about statistical models than she probably ever cared to, although I hope she continues to learn more about them. I hope, so please just join me in welcoming Cadet Brigida Hendricks for her presentation.
All right, first I'm going to get my timer real quick so I don't go over time. So first, thank you everybody for coming. I know that some of you guys aren't here by choice because we have to go to presentations as honors cadets, but I hope that by the end of this presentation you care a little bit about this topic because I do really think it's very fascinating, otherwise I wouldn't have picked it. But first, I think it's important to give credit where credit is due and thank Colonel Heinerman. With only 66 days till graduation, not that I'm counting, but I've been able to experience a lot of incredible professors here, but none of them, for me personally, has had such a profound effect on, I think, where I am now, but also where I'm going to be after VMI. Colonel Heinerman has gotten me to open my eyes to consider things that I definitely would have not given a second chance to in terms of what I'd like to pursue after graduating. And he's got a very, very good ability to push students to kind of challenge their own potential, but also he knows when to kind of let us kind of take a back seat and let us deal with the other stresses of VMI. So thank you very, very much. So my topic is Western-based globalized universities. Does education really threaten regime control? So like Colonel Heinerman mentioned, there's a lot of literature out there that discusses higher education as something that can threaten an authoritarian regime. Basically just because you have a higher university that can instill democratic ideals, that can lead to more civil society forming, and things like that. But at the same time, and despite these threats, we have branch campuses today in authoritarian regimes that are thriving. And you have authoritarian regimes welcoming these outside sources of education. So I think it's important to note that I don't assume the curricula to be completely the same. So I wouldn't assume that New York University in Abu Dhabi completely matches our New York University, but I also think it's important to note that while there's a lot of literature discussing the threats of higher education, you can also see the appeal for any regime to want to invest in higher education because a more educated population is going to have a more educated and better skilled workforce, and then better workforce means better economy and then more money in your pocket as the regime ruler. So basically this is the puzzle that I'm interested in trying to uncover where and why you have these universities coming to from democracies to authoritarian regimes. And my original interest in this topic came from a piece by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and George W. Downs, and they basically talk about how a regime can provide what they call coordination goods, which are, it's just a set different types of goods that they can provide to their people, which can threaten the regime. And then they have public goods, which do not threaten the regime. So in the coordination threatening regime category falls higher education, and in the public goods category, which is not threatening, falls primary education. So they kind of look at this puzzle, which is where I got my initial interest, and discuss how that's kind of an interesting balance that you see being walked right now between these authoritarian regimes. That's echoed by a 74% correlation between polity scores and the years of average schooling that citizens have. So a polity score, if you don't know, that's just kind of a ranking for how democratic or non-democratic a country is. And so the more democratic a country is on average, this study found the more years of education the people in the population had. And then another big piece of literature that really stuck out to me was written by Howard Sanborn and Clayton Tyne, and they just further connect higher education to producing more nuanced analytical thinkers. And so when you have more nuanced analytical thinkers, then you have people questioning and doing what I talked about earlier, establishing common grievances and kind of coming together to form civil society. So given all of this, my question is, in which authoritarian regimes today do we see the existence of Western-based globalized universities? Before I move on after the question, to set a few definitions, for authoritarian regime types, I'm borrowing a little bit from the work of Jennifer Gandhi, and she just says an authoritarian regime is one in which the ruler came to power not by competitive elections. And I broke that down into 5 different types, so military, monarchy, personalist, single party, and then a hybrid, which is just a combination of 2 or more of those regimes. And then the Western-based globalized university, I honestly just kind of came up with that phrase, but it's based in literature from Natalie Koch, and it's referring to institutions of higher education that have strong ties to the West or Western institutions, and the West is just being limited to North America or Europe strictly. So, I have 4 hypotheses. The first one states that out of currently existing regimes, authoritarian regimes, we would be most likely to see personalist regimes housing the most Western-based globalized universities. The reason that I arrived at that hypothesis is because if you think about the structure of a personalist regime, it's very much kind of like a pyramid. And so you have a person at the top who has to keep the loyalty of his or her supporters by providing access to rents and access to goods. And so that means it's very important that they have a really big pie, so to speak. That's kind of how I think of it. A really big pie to have enough pieces of the pie to go around to keep everyone loyal and supporting their regime, and then they stay in a job. And so because of that, I figured, okay, if you have to have a really big pie to be able to share and keep people loyal to your regime, and trade is really important for you in a good economy, then that means that international rapport and international relationships is probably very, very important. So because of that, I sort of borrowed from the idea put forth by Barbara Geddes in some of her literature, where she discusses these types of international universities as being kind of a bargaining chip in the international arena. It's kind of like, okay, I'll let you put a university in my country, and that kind of shows that I'm open to being affected by you, and I'm open to having some of your ideas affect my students potentially, and I'm open to discussion with you, things like that. And in exchange, you're expecting to have a good open relationship, good trade, and things like that. So personalist regimes, because of their structure, I just figured that they would be most open to having Western-based globalized universities. Hypothesis 2 follows similar assumptions and just states that a high amount of FDI or foreign direct investment will indicate a higher likelihood of housing Western-based globalized universities. That's just going along the same lines as hypothesis 1 is, and then hypothesis 3 is that the existence of opposition groups will decrease the likelihood of Western-based globalized universities in a state, and that's because even if the literature weren't true, even if education were just possibly a threat to your regime, if you already have the threat in the form of people coming together and forming an opposition group against your regime in power, you're probably not even going to want to test it and try to experience a potential threat from higher education. Hypothesis 4 is that the existence of domestic universities will increase your likelihood of having a Western-based globalized university. That's just basically saying that if Kyrgyzstan has, University of Kyrgyzstan, that shows that that state is already willing to invest into the education of its people, and so potentially that means that they're more willing to invest in an outside source of education as well. So this table shows my dependent and independent variables. I do have a set of control variables not shown here but shown later. And what getting to this point kind of looked at is I started with polity scores, the previously mentioned kind of ranking of democracy to non-democracy, and cut off anything below a 6 as being a non-democracy. So from there I was at about 100 different countries, which was a lot, so I randomized the list and then took the first 31. So we had 31 randomized non-democracies, and over a 10-year period from 2000 to 2010. So right there already was already about 330 different cases. And then from there, I went through and identified all of the different universities and ended up with almost 1,300 different universities. So that's a little bit where Colonel Hyman was talking about how painstaking this process was. I definitely underestimated how much time would be put into it, for sure. But to give a little bit of an idea of what that data collection looked like was a lot of unhappy faces staring at my laptop for a long time. But Kyrgyzstan, this is just a screenshot of a little bit of it. This is 22 of Kyrgyzstan's 44 total universities, including domestic and Western-based. And so what I would do for each of the 31 countries is I would first make a list of all of the universities. So Kyrgyzstan was relatively easy. Russia was awful. It took forever. And so I made a list of all of the universities, and then I went through and I figured out the year in which it was established. So if it was established after 2010, I went ahead and threw it out because it wasn't established before or during 2010. Sorry, 2000 to 2010. Then I went through and denoted whether it was public or private, and from there was kind of the tricky part where I had to decide if it was a domestic university or a Western-based globalized university. Sometimes that was pretty easy. If it's American University of this state, that's pretty obvious, but sometimes it was really, really tricky. So there was a lot of going to Wikipedia pages and then trying to find a website. And I was joking about it earlier, but in all seriousness, I don't understand how I don't have a crazy virus on my computer from going to like really weird Russian college websites, and it was all written in another language and in weird colors and stuff, but I don't yet. So after going through that and figuring out if it was a Western-based globalized university, then I kind of added a few qualitative aspects to it to just kind of get a better understanding of what it was that I was looking at. And so that's when I went through and saw, okay, is it a co-ed university? Does it accept international students? What kind of degrees does it offer? Is its language of instruction mainly English, or is it something else? Is it religious? Things like that, and that's what this half of the chart is. So that's just an example. And the mean for Western-based globalized universities of all 31 countries was 1.21 in country year data, which means that this is pretty rare. And that's shown a little bit more clearly in this histogram. So most countries have 0, some of the countries have some, and then a small handful of the countries have a lot, like 9 or 10 in one country. And so because of that rarity, I ran a negative binomial regression model, and I'm just saying right now, any questions will probably be deferred to Colonel Hireman on that, but I can try my best. And this slide just gives a little bit of a visual of So if you see Iraq has 0, that's black. Papua New Guinea over here is 2. Liberia is in between 2 black countries, but it's actually blue. They have 3, Kyrgyzstan has 4, and then Thailand, red, has 9. The United Arab Emirates has 10. This slide shows a model that includes a variable for each of my core hypotheses, as well as some control variables. And what it shows is that the two of the variables linked to my hypotheses, so personalist regimes and domestic universities, were both significant. But contrary to what I thought in the beginning, personalist regimes is negative. The negative sign in front of the number next to personalist regimes means that personalist regimes are actually less likely to house Western-based globalized universities. They're still significant, meaning that it didn't really happen by chance, most likely, but the negative means that it's less likely to house Western-based globalized universities. And then domestic universities held as significant in every single one of the models. And so you can look at that a little bit more closely in this graph. The dotted line is personalist regimes. The solid line is not personalist regimes. So as you go this way, the more domestic universities you have, the more Western-based globalized universities you have, but personalist regimes are less likely to have them. The next slide is pretty similar, but I swapped out personalist regimes for monarchies, and I did do this for all of the regime types, so if you're curious, I have them at the very, very end of the presentation, even though they weren't significant. But so monarchy ended up also being significant and positive, which I thought was really, really cool. So that means that as you have more domestic universities in the country, you have more Western-based globalized universities, but you have even more if it's a monarchy. So that was something that I found really, really cool and definitely was not expecting. Again, FDI and polity scores were not significant. That's for the second and third hypotheses. And then to kind of give a possible why for why this might have occurred. So for hypothesis 1, the one about personalist regimes, it's significant but not in the predicted direction. That was what I was saying about it being negative. It wasn't how I predicted it to be. And this is an area where I would really like to do some more case studies and do a more qualitative approach, given that we still have a lot more time left in the semester. But kind of in the past week, Colonel Hireman and I were talking about this, and so one possible why for why this occurred is because my logic was based on financial linkages. But if you really think about it from a different perspective, a personalist regime is like a little pyramid, and then a Western-based globalized university kind of introduces a rival pyramid. So then all of a sudden you have a rival hierarchy to the one that's trying to maintain its tight grip on society. And so from that perspective, I can understand why, if I were to put myself in the shoes of a personalist ruler, I probably wouldn't want something like that in my country. And then a monarchy, on the other hand, has every place within its hierarchy, and who's in charge is based on lineage. So if you have a rival hierarchy, it's not really a rival, because there's no way for it to cross over and enter into who's in charge, really, because it's just the nature of how monarchy is functioning. Hypothesis 2, foreign direct investment was not significant, and so that just goes to show again that perhaps this is not just about trade relations, which is what I originally predicted. Hypothesis 3 was not significant. Opposition groups was not significant, and I apologize, I forgot to mention this earlier. My opposition groups was measured with a proxy, the proxy for opposition groups was polity scores. So my initial thought after this was that maybe if I had picked something that maybe like indicated the strength and the size of the opposition groups instead of just a polity score, it would have probably or possibly yielded something different. So that's something that I would love to go back and redo, but for now it is not significant. And then hypothesis 4, domestic universities held as significant in every single model, which is pretty cool. But that indicates an overlap with the original assumption that countries that have more domestic universities welcoming this type of university. And then something that also came to me in the last week of just sort of re-looking at this is maybe it's more an issue of supply and demand. So maybe rather than how I was originally looking at all of this, the fact that a country has domestic universities sort of indicates a willingness to, or it already shows itself as more attractive to potential investors for a variety of different reasons. So for one, if you already have your own universities, you already have a population that's educated to a certain level. So that means you're going to be able to take advantage of an outside university. And then for somebody who's wanting to not just plant a university, but maybe plant somewhere where it's going to produce its own product or good, you have already a more ripe, skilled, higher educated workforce to be able to take advantage of that. So as an investor, it just kind of seems like a smarter move for me to go to a